To order, please. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please remain standing. Following the Pledge of Allegiance will be a silent moment of reflection. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And we will move on to the reading of the notice, please.
The educational and annual meeting and budget hearing of the Marathon County Board of Supervisors, composed of 38 members, will convene at the Marathon County Courthouse Assembly Room, 500 4th Street, Wausau, on Friday, November 1st at 3 p.m., and the agenda was duly signed and posted.
Thank you. I would like to request everyone, please put your cell phones and any other electronic devices on silent as to not be an interruption to the meeting, and I thank you for your indulgence. And we'll move on to roll call, and I'd ask everyone please sign in.
Okay.
Thank you, and I'll note that we have 16 supervisors here in person. We also have 7 supervisors, 8 persons on WebEx, so thank you. And we will, I would like to welcome all the visitors that we have, including the visitors that are joining by TV and watching online. So we'll move on to public comment. We do not have anybody signed up for public comment. We do have the open public hearing and have people signed up for public comment during the public hearing. So we will move on to item number B, budget hearing, and item B8, the overview of the published budget by HR Finance and Property Committee Chair, Supervisor Robinson.
Thank you. Let me just walk you back through the process of how we've gotten to where we are today. Then I'll turn it over to the administrator because basically the guts of what we're considering are what's in his budget. But a couple of years ago, there was concerns about the input from the county board relative to the development of the budget. So we changed our process and engage the county board at both the board level and at committee level in the setting of the priorities and development of the assumptions for the budget. And you acted on those in May, June, and July, and all the committees were asked to look at those items that were under their jurisdiction or the purview of those committees and make recommendations relative to any changes in priorities or new programs or fee increases in an effort to try to do it. Some of the priorities, we said 3% increase in salaries between priorities and assumptions, no borrowing for it, live within our means. Basically, we put in some assumptions relative to healthcare costs, utility costs, and other things. But it was used to develop a budget that basically is a status quo budget. And committees provided input. We heard from the Health and Human Services Committee relative to the beach inspection program and a number of other programs, and other committees made comments on different areas, and I think the administrator did his best to try to incorporate those recommendations in his budget. The budget was delayed this year, and we're hopeful that in future years we'll get the budget earlier in the process to give us more time to focus on the final version of the budget, but that's because of the transition to Workday. And I want to commend the administrator, the finance director, and all the staff that have been involved in developing the budget, working through some difficult times and on a changing software and hardware package in developing and presenting this to us today. But it is basically a status quo budget. There was the hearing before the committee. From today, we will take the comments that we receive. All the committees will be meeting between now and the time that the budget is adopted. We encourage you to look at those areas under your purview. If you've got changes, submit those. Submit them by, I think that's a week from today, the 8th. So in the Finance Committee, we'll meet on the 11th. Later in the agenda, you will be asked to approve a second hearing. This was supposed to be our official hearing. State law requires that it be posted with the official newspaper, which is the Daily Herald. I know our finance director worked diligently and thought she had assurances that it would be posted in time to have this meeting fulfill that. Unfortunately, we didn't have the 15-day notice, so we're asking that the board designate the Finance Committee to have the hearing compliant with the state law. It's a good reason for us to revisit some of the underlying statutory requirements for us to do. But this is a status quo budget, and I think we're trying to maintain the quality. There are increases in the Sheriff's Department reflecting the agreement with Rib Mountain to extend that officer. There are increases in some of the others. The medical examiner's office is up because of the Forensic Science Center that is coming online, and there are opportunities and challenges as we go forward, but I'll turn it over to the administrator for his comments.
Administrator Leonard, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. Thank you for the kind words relative to the budget. I said this at the Towns Association meeting. The statute calls upon the administrator and administrator counties to deliver the administrator's budget, but really, based on the new process that Chair Robinson referenced, I really do think I delivered your budget. You gave a lot of very clear direction, which again, I really greatly appreciate. I know my staff appreciate as well. Whether it was your budget priorities and guidelines, the budget assumptions, the program discussions we had at the various committees, it's a far different and I think a far better process than has historically been used, where much was left to county administration and department heads. Instead, we really worked to carry out your will throughout the process, I should say. The only other thing I'll add to what Chair Robinson referenced is kind of what is coming up beyond the public hearings and the opportunities for further modification. There are two amendments that are going to be requested by staff. Specifically, they're really finance and accounting amendments, and if you have questions, they're posted on the website right next to the annual budget. Sam can walk you through those, but really simply housekeeping in nature. They don't change the levy in any way. They don't modify programs in any way in terms of the direction you've given and relative to what programs or services do we deliver, at what level, and at what cost. They really are simply those housekeeping pieces. So that's all I have. Of course, I gave a much longer budget message presentation to HR Finance, and the link is there for you to watch at your leisure. I would make a recommendation. You slide the bar on YouTube and speed it up to maybe 1.5 times. Save yourself about 30 minutes. But if you do have any questions, I know a number of you have reached out to me since the budget was proposed and asked questions. Happy to continue to answer those.
Okay. Supervisor Robinson, please.
And I'm trying to follow the order.
Yep.
The Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee did adopt one amendment prior to the publication. That was an amendment authored by Supervisor Marash and myself, dealing with the setting aside funding for a casual employee to help with our tax delinquent property, surplus property, and redevelopment housing initiatives in the budget. The Human Resources Finance Property Committee has been looking at the issue of our delinquent property taxes, and we just recently discovered the existence of a counter book that contains the number of tax deeds and the amount of tax deeds, and we've got a significant amount of tax delinquent properties. We would like to work on that to reduce it. What happens every year is that after tax time, the January through July process, the county basically squares with all local units of government, and we buy their tax rolls, or in essence, we pay them, whether you're a town, village, city, school district, or the vocational school. We buy the taxes, and we basically go on, we have that debt or back taxes. After a period of time, typically 3 years, if they have not paid, we can foreclose on that through the tax foreclosure process outlined in the state statutes under Chapter 75. That has grown over the years. We recently changed the process from a tax deed process to an NREM process. We're thinking that we could expedite the process. We've had some success with that. We ran 50 properties through that. 32 of them settled. 18 were taken. And we currently, unfortunately, we haven't caught up. In 2010, 11, and 12, we wrote off $98,000 of back taxes and special assessments. We also, anything that we buy the special assessments. For instance, if you've got a sewer and water project in front of you and you don't make that payment, that becomes a special assessment on your tax bill, and the county picks that up. So we're looking for ways to narrow or reduce that list, get it current. After 10 years, we can't collect those back taxes, so we're again, we lost that $98,000. We think that there's need for someone to help with that. Once we take those properties, there are new requirements on us prior to the selling, but typically we'll look at that property. Is there a value to the county to hold that property, or to the local unit of government? And if there's not, our current process is still listed with surplus property through the state of Wisconsin and sell it. But there's a recent Supreme Court decision involving Hennepin County in Minnesota and changes to the state law that if we take a property and then sell it at a more than we have into it, we must return that or make an effort to return it to the former property owner. And that adds time, expense, and effort to it. And we're working on updating our ordinances to reflect some of those changes. WCA, Wisconsin Counties Association, has developed some template language for that. But at the same time that Finance was looking at this, Chair Marash and the Extension Education Economic Development Committee, a handful or a mouthful, has been working on the issue of housing and how do we redevelop those properties. So the Finance Committee also looked at where our surplus property is and are there opportunities for us to sell off that surplus property. And based on action that was taken in December of last year, outlining housing as a goal and trying to increase the amount of housing for the workforce, an effort was trying to take a look at those properties to see if there's any application for housing, which we did at the last meeting for that 8th Avenue property associated with affectionately UWMC or UW Stevens Point, WASA, that was no longer in use. So, and we're also going to next year have 2 large properties that will finally be available. The credit union will be moving out of the Thomas Street location, and we will be vacating River Drive. So we will have opportunities associated with both of those properties to redevelop them and look at what's in the best interest of the county. All of those efforts require staff and support. For us to sit there and say we can do all these things and with our current workforce is ill-founded, and we just can't do it. And Supervisor Marash and I will be sending out a email with the justification for the position later today or Monday morning. But we felt it was necessary to create temporary help for the county to work through this backlog, this housing shortage, economic development opportunities, and deal with those tax delinquent properties.
Okay. We will now move on to item 9B, public reading of the proposed 2025 budget. Clerk Trueblood, please.
Residents and taxpayers will take notice that the Marathon County Board of Supervisors has arranged for a public hearing on the 2025 tentative budget to be held in the Marathon County Assembly Room at the Marathon County Courthouse, Wausau, Wisconsin. An official public hearing is scheduled for Friday, November 1st, 2024 at 3 p.m. and Monday, November 11th, 2024 at 3 p.m., with final approval on Tuesday, November 12th, 2024 at 6 p.m. The public hearing will be for the benefit of Marathon County taxpayers who desire to be heard. The following is a summary of the tentative 2025 budget. Public inspection of the detailed report may take place at the office of the county clerk. Proposed for 2025, tax levy is $59,851,312. Mill rate is $3.79. Equalized value is $15,775,534,800.
Thank you. We will now move, and I will open the public hearing on the proposed 2025 county budget. But before we begin taking comment, I want to remind the audience and our interested commenters about the rules related to public comment at public hearings. First, our county board rules allow public comments at the public hearing only if the comments offer consistent input on the Marathon County proposed 2025 budget. If your comments stray from that topic, I will ask that you explain how your comments are related to the budget. Second, please address your comments and input to me, the chair, and not to the audience and not any particular member of the body. Directing your comments to the chair is an important rule of decorum. It helps to ensure that comments do not become personal or offensive. If a comment does create a personal attack, I will direct you to end your comments and move on to the next speaker. Our board rules apportion 3 minutes for each speaker for public hearings. If a previous speaker has made comment that you agree with, you're welcome to simply indicate your agreement with the previous speaker. I do ask that the audience refrain from responding directly to a commenter or from applauding or voicing reaction to a particular commenter. In addition to the previous preserving civility in the room, this will also allow us to keep the business of the board in a timely manner. And I will now open the public hearing, and we have had at least one individual who has requested to provide comment, although they did not have to pre-register, but in this case, they did. Mr. Baker, you will be afforded 3 minutes to address the board.
Thank you. I'm Dave Baker. I live in Kronewetter, and I want to thank Administrator Leonard, Finance Director Fensky, and each of the department heads for your excellent job in putting the budget together. My comments today are directed to the County Board Supervisors. You have the difficult task of finding the right balance between keeping property taxes low for Marathon County residents and providing the resources needed for Marathon County government. Many of the county fund balances have increased substantially over the last few years, which raises the question of whether county property taxes are too high. In my blog at marathoncountyspotlight.com, I propose 2 ideas for reducing the taxes on our county residents, relating to repealing the will tax and changing the CIP rollover policy. I don't know if there's realistically enough time left this year to discuss and get consensus on those 2 items. As a result, I'm proposing a very simple method to reduce the 2025 property tax by $1 million. This method will reduce the tax burden on county property owners with absolutely no impact on budget employee positions or funding of service levels in 2025 and 2026. It will reduce the amount of CIP rollover in 2027 by $1 million, but that should not be an issue because of the wise use of much of the $24 million in ARPA funding has allowed the county to catch up on CIP needs. The proposal would simply reduce the debt levy by $1 million and increase the use of sales tax for debt service by $1 million. The estimated revenue from sales tax would increase from 16 million to 17 million, which should not be an issue with the amount of CIP rollover built into the 2025 budget. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Do we have any other interested individuals wishing to provide comment during the public hearing? Any individuals, any additional individuals? Do we have anybody online that wishes to? Okay. Seeing no other additional comments, we will close the public hearing, and we will move on to item C, budget discussion by board members. Item C12, discussion by board members regarding the proposed 2025 budget. Any discussion by board members? Supervisor Sandalski, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I got a few questions. And first one, with relation to the sales tax. So we budgeted 16 million last year, and we're so far at 17,184,000. I'm just curious as to where does that extra sales tax go after, like, to the next year? Where does that go into? What fund does that go into?
I can generally answer that
Administrator Lar,
question.
please.
So the amount of sales tax budgeted first, to your point, 16 million last year and also proposed as 16 million is based on the direction provided by the county board. When you set your budget assumptions, you directed me to set a $16 million revenue. What happens should we ultimately receive more money than budgeted? Marathon County's historical process, as was just alluded to in the comments, is that in the year following the audit, so once we find out truly what our revenues are throughout the year for sales tax, any amount above what was budgeted in the year following the audit then rolls over into the capital improvement fund to fund capital improvement projects as part of the budget preparation, again, in the year following the audit. So in the last HR Finance and Property Committee meeting, Deputy Administrator Holman presented a 5-year capital forecast, a 5-year capital improvement plan, just laying out kind of large capital improvement needs we have throughout the county, so you can get some idea as to what the need is, and then how we fund that is through any rollover, not only sales tax, but any amount of budgeted revenue in excess of expense in the general fund rolls over in the year following the audit to fund those capital projects. I don't know if there's anything Sam or Committee Chair Robinson want to add on that.
Supervisor Robinson, please.
I think we tried to take a conservative approach relative to sales tax, and if you look at the actual sales tax receipts for the first 6 months of this year, 3 months were above where we were the previous year, 3 months were below, and there was some speculation we might be looking at a recession. I think we wanted to be conservative relative to the approach to estimating what those sales tax revenues are. And given the fact that we roll those over and use it in our capital improvement plan, we're not spending them on operational items, but rather saving them for capital and trying to do as best as we can to make this a recession-proof budget.
Just to clarify, though, we do budget 16 million. We utilize 16 million. It's not as though all of that 16 million is available for capital. It's only that amount beyond what is budgeted for revenue. So to your point, let's assume that this year our revenues for sales tax come in at $17.1 million, which is 1.1 million over what our projected was as part of the last year's budget. We would, following the audit where we find out truly what amount was received, and then also find out what amount beyond our general revenues over expense are above our funding policies that the board has, that amount following the audit, would roll over for purposes of funding capital projects. So,
And I might add, just the other thing that it does is it effectively allows then the county to use those dollars for CIP projects without the need for borrowing, which would increase the costs to maintain the properties that the county has and the taxpayers expect us to maintain.
I got a few more. Thank you. I got a couple more questions. So what's the status on the highway department relocation and the building of that? Is there any update on that?
sure. We've actually had meetings at infrastructure as well as HR Finance where we presented, I think the last one at HR Finance, I want to say was either July or August, relative to kind of what are the options that are available for that meeting, similar to the infrastructure meeting. A portion of it was held in closed session based on, statutorily permitted reasons for us to go into closed session. But the general direction we've received from infrastructure as well as HR Finance is to continue to move forward and finalize a financing plan for that facility. So if you take a look at the audit from last year and the presentations that were made to infrastructure and to HR Finance, you'll see that our highway reserve has grown. The current working plan was to designate $26 million from that highway reserve for the express purpose, as was alluded to by Chair Gibbs, relative to capital generally speaking, was to use that $26 million to limit the need to, or negate the need to borrow that portion of the building construction costs. Generally, the estimates we have from working with our various consultants on that relocation is that it would be in the neighborhood of, and don't hold me to the number, but I want to say approximately $59 million based on our cost projections that we've had. So we would have to then work with our financial consultants to figure out when, in fact, you would move forward with acquiring land, when you would then put out the RFP for design, architecture, and when you would move forward with construction. The project itself is probably about a 3-year project in terms of 18 months of design finalization and 18 months of construction. So site acquisition would be the first step. I don't know if there are any other specific pieces on that you were looking for, but the general consensus has been consistent for the last several years that the highway shop on West Street is no longer meeting the needs of the county and certainly won't meet them long term.
Okay, thank you. I had one more question too. So for the ARPA funds, right now we get 10 million, about 10,758,000 unencumbered. So those aren't designated to any. Are those not designated to any right now?
I believe approximately we have about slightly over $2 million of funds that HR Finance has been working on that are a combination of either unencumbered funds or ARPA funds that we want to reallocate from existing allocations to a single project. Right now, the working plan is to, and you can look at the last HR Finance and Property meeting for information on this, but Deputy Administrator Holman worked with Sam, Finance Director Fensky, to put together a plan to essentially ensure that we maximize all of our American Rescue Plan Act funds and not have any lapse back to the federal government. But it's just in excess of $2 million. We've
Okay, sorry.
allocated the rest.
I must have got the wrong numbers. I must have wrote the wrong numbers down. Sorry about that.
No, that we had some funds that previously we did allocate and then we unencumbered. So the 10 million you probably did find right from the spreadsheet itself that had $10 million for one project. We allocated $10 million was for highway, but essentially we then changed our strategy. The board changed its strategy with respect to deployment of those funds. But in essence, we're slightly above $2 million that we need to shore up before the end of the year to meet the American Rescue Plan Act deadline of having those funds allocated and encumbered by the end of the year.
Okay, Supervisor
you.
Robinson has a direct response also.
Just to provide additional clarification on that, we are looking at we have to encumber those funds by December 31st of this year, or we lose them. So Administrator Leonard and I had a conversation earlier this week, and I just asked him to go back and truth test or kick the tires on all the projects to make sure that we will indeed spend the money where we've encumbered the money, so we don't unintentionally lose it. And then we'll be bringing a plan to you in the next month or so on the final allocation of those funds. But generally, the thought is that we will look at those 4 capital improvement projects within the county.
Supervisor Wilhelm, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I had a question on the interest from the money that we have invested from reserves. So when you said that the interest goes into the general fund, how is that allocated? Because it's something you can't really rely on because of the fluctuating of rates. And like the highway or infrastructure, highway department, the money that they have, does that just get allocated back into the highway department reserve, or is that put into the general fund also?
We'll let Sam take your pure financing questions, but essentially any interest, our ability to invest is fundamentally different as a county than your personal ability to invest. Our investment ability, as alluded to by Chair Robinson before in previous meetings about the broadband funding and the rate of return. Our return is a modest one when things go well, but with respect to interest, generally speaking, it's not as though we allocate through the budget a great deal of revenue to go out to departments from interest income, but I'll let Sam take a fair amount of that question.
The interest is part of the operating budget to support it. Anything in excess there, again, funnels down and through the CIP process. As far as allocation, a lot of it depends on where that original funding came from. So some of our investments, some of our dollars are restricted in some sort of fashion. For instance, one might be like in social services, we do have a Social Security account. That money has to stay within that account. So we will do allocations like that, but in the general fund, we don't put it into each individual department. It might just end up sitting in the treasurer's interest income account.
It would stay there and we're not actually using it?
It is part of the budgeting plan. So it does offset some of the other expenditures, but just on a broad overall sense, not one specific item.
Okay, so it's not actually allocated, it's just used if we need it type of thing? Or-
No, it is allocated. So the interest is, some of the interest is earned, comes into the general fund and is allocated for general operations, but not in a specific program. It's part of the general revenue. Now, we're conservative in our nature in what we allocate or budget for interest income, but we do budget for that interest income. Supervisor Lemmer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to connect some dots because earlier this afternoon I was at the Community Partners Campus, which invited some state people because November is Homelessness Awareness Month. And I think the position that we are hoping to fund through this amendment that Chair Marash and Chair Robinson are putting forth will make a difference in that long-term homelessness goal. And here's the reason why, because if we are looking at prevention, we need to build housing stock. And I think this position, getting somebody who is able to coordinate the sale of those properties or some of those other things, is going to open up some of that housing stock. So anyway, I just thought I'd put that plug in. So thank you to the chairs for being visionary in your thinking.
Supervisor Marshall, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 3 questions. So the first is to Administrator Leonard, how many full-time equivalent positions are budgeted but are not either here today or have a current job requisition out on the system for a position opening?
I can look into that. I know that I don't have the answer to that. I know I talked with Krista from Social Services in the back. I believe we have a couple of positions that are the children's long-term support positions that are fully grant funded, where we previously told the board we were going to onboard those over time to ensure we can train appropriately. So I believe there's 4 that aren't posted. We, generally speaking, if there's a job opening, we have it posted. I have a vacancy in my department that's not, but that's because I'm making some changes to the job description. But generally speaking, we post those jobs if they're not filled. With an exception, I would say we don't try to keep, for example, in the sheriff's office, I see Chad's in the back, we always have a need for corrections. That's one of our exceptions, to have corrections just generally out there doing recruitment. But our standard practice is, if we have an opening, we post it for a time certain, close that recruitment, evaluate the candidates, and if we don't have a good candidate pool, we go back and repost. Specific numbers, other than the ones in social services and the one in my department, I'm not aware of any, but I can certainly get you that information.
Okay, thank you. It would appear that we had 196 for the sheriff's department. Currently, I believe you're at 182, so that would leave you with 14 openings. And to have 14 openings for an entire year's worth, unless we have an influx of candidates, it would seem that that would be an area that we're over budgeting.
Can I respond to that? So one of the areas we have 8, operationally, we're 8 short in corrections right now. We want to fill those. We certainly, attrition is something you can budget for, and we have, but I encourage you, if you have thoughts on that, please reach out. Attrition in the sheriff's department actually costs us more money because, and Chad can elaborate, but our experience, as I alluded to in the budget, last year was such, and this year was such, that we asked deputies to cover shifts for corrections officers in the jail on overtime, because we have mandates relative to our 24/7 programs to have mandatory staffing levels. So when we don't meet those, we're either asking current staff in those departments to fill them, or we are asking, in this instance, my example, we called deputies in to cover those shifts. Again, often at overtime, but even if it was straight time, it's a higher cost. The same is true for communications, and we have, Chad, how many? Two openings in communications right now. We have an individual that just retired in the sheriff's office, is another position I know that we have vacant. We have one that is going to be taking a new position within the county on January 2nd. So we do frequently have positions open, but that we don't, generally speaking, budget for attrition, because in a lot of instances it costs us money, or we lose the reimbursement. Highway's a
I
good
think it's
example.
more, if you're able, is there even a pool of people that you could hire 14? It is what I was referring to, not your need. I understand your need. I'm just saying that we were in the same position last year, where we said we're going to really put an emphasis on recruiting, and we're going to get there, and we're going to be fully staffed. And yet it's a matter of the pool may not exist.
I think that's
I think the one thing that I would add, though, is I think there has been progress made, significant progress on the jailing staff. And one of the shortfalls, one of the challenges was jailing staff. Currently, I think you said 3, Chad, or 2 openings in the jail staff that we're recruiting for.
In the jail, it shows as 8. We have 3 currently
Okay.
in the hiring process, so there's 5. And those 5 are being held for females because we have to keep our male-female ratio.
Right, sure. But that has improved significantly from what it was previous.
My second question is on plan for 2025. How much of the treasurer's office do we have for property tax interest and fines being paid when we're emphasizing this tax deeded properties? I know that as you go to court and you tell somebody they're taking the property, they often come up with the money. How much of our budget is that property tax interest and fines?
I don't believe we budget any of the interest and penalty. We don't budget any of that use until it's actually collected, and then it goes into the general revenue.
So
Well,
anything collected would be a windfall?
We'll let Sam answer that. We do budget for interest and penalty, and she can talk to you about how we handle that on the finance side. But whether that interest and penalty accrual exceeds what we take in based on some people not paying, therein always lies the balance.
Currently, in the 2025 budget, we have $138,500 budgeted for interest on taxes, and we have $100,000 budgeted for penalty on taxes. Have a moment, I can let you know where we are currently. And it looks to be consistent with what we had budgeted into the 2024. We had interest of $138,500 and penalty on taxes of $100,000. It's been a relatively decent collection year where we've received about $658,000 in interest and penalties combined. Sorry, excess of the budget. But there are years when that number may not be as high.
Okay.
And then my third question is, the sale of the properties that we have that are not tax deeded, do we have anything in the budget for the sale of those properties?
No. And part of that is because when we sell the property, due to Act 216, what we can collect on is the face value of the taxes, the special assessments, charges, and delinquent utilities, the interest and penalty that was charged out to it, and then staff time in order to sell it.
I think she was referring to any non-tax deeded properties.
Oh, sorry.
County-owned properties is what I think Supervisor's referring to.
My apologies. No, there is nothing in the budget for 2025 on that.
So those would just get receipted then in the general fund. In fact, we just sold property today that was referred to that you guys approved at your last meeting. So we dropped off a $60,000 check that would have been receipted into the general fund.
So is it sufficient to say that anything that we sell for county-owned property could offset the position and the additional expense for that position?
If you budgeted it that way, you could. Essentially what that is spending from your reserves. But you certainly can, because right now it's booked as an asset, but you would say, hey, we're going to transfer this to, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, but we would budget a transfer for the receipt of the funds. Then you could use those revenues to fund a position. Does that sound right, Sam?
Yes.
Supervisor Robinson,
I think that there's another nuance to that. It depends upon how we acquired it. You know, so for that surplus property, there may be funding sources that we have to honor the obligations associated with the purchase. So each property has to be evaluated on its own merits. So that's another factor that has to be reviewed at the time of the sale. And I would, for instance, well, I'll turn it over to the administrator.
Yeah, that's a good point. With respect to highway, for example, property acquired for purposes of highway right-of-way expansion, and I know Jim's not here, and maybe Mike knows this off the top of his head, but there are some limitations on what you have to do with those funds. If they came from the highway reserve for acquisition, they would have to be returned. But generally speaking, for example, River Drive and Thomas Street are the two that were referred to before. I don't believe there's any restrictions on those funds. I haven't looked at, they were acquired a great many years ago. But my sense is that those funds, should they be redeveloped in a way that the funding would go into the county's general fund. That's where we would have a spend out of the general fund for a position or any other purpose you'd want to use.
I'm sorry, so did you say that the property you sold today just goes into the general fund?
Correct. So the 60, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, what we took that check in, it was the UW Stevens Point Wausau parking lot that you approved on, at your last meeting, 405 South 8th Avenue was sold. The $60,000 would get receipted into the general fund, and then similarly to what I referenced with sales tax, in the year following the audit, based on your existing fund balance policies, any amount in excess of the fund balance policy that would then be available for rollover for capital improvements above those policies, that's generally how they're used. Again, you spend out of the general fund, you have done that in the past. You did that at your last meeting too, $8 million out of the general fund. What that essentially does is it's going to reduce the amount that will roll over in the year following the audit.
Vice Chair Dickinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just make really 3 comments. The first is, it was mentioned by Supervisor Robinson that this is a status quo budget. But then you hear about Amendment 1 with this housing initiative. And the comment was made, all of these efforts require support and staff. Another supervisor, Supervisor Lemmer, said we need to build housing stock. So this is exactly the kind of thing that I've been talking about for the 4 years I've been on the board. We have a comp plan, then a strategic plan, then we have a committee adoption, and then we have the county adoption, then we have a task force and a work group, and we spend $50,000 to review and analyze, and we say, well, you know, we're just looking into it. And then what do we do? Well, now we have a $157,000 position to do this thing because, you know, it's really this great concern. And now we have to take action as government. It is this buildup, this domino, one step at a time, that I would encourage all of you to really consider when we put forth these small efforts. So that's just a general comment about where we are. Second comment, I've said this before as well, and I'll say it a different way. Government, it should be the responsibility of government to the taxpayers, do for the taxpayers what they cannot do for themselves. And as a traditional kind of government person, I believe that falls into a couple major categories. One would be policing, another would be roads, infrastructure. Those are things that people reasonably cannot do for themselves, and that we all can kind of agree to say, this is what we can do. What government should not do, or government gets into and never really solves, is these kind of social issues that crop up. Things like jobs, workforce, housing, childcare. We're going to try to cure everyone of the ill that they have, some through no fault of their own. And we think that we're helping people when, in essence, we're not really doing that. Government does very poorly at helping people in those issues. The third comment I'll state, and the chair had made this, talks about the general fund and taxing people. It is very common for governments to do this at all levels. They will tax to a certain dollar amount, intending that to be, because they have to by law, put it into certain areas. Well, guess what? Every government taxes more than they need. Then they take that additional amount and it ends up in a reserve, and then it gets audited after a year, and then it ends up, and you have this fund balance of $54 million or $58 million, and you're saying to yourself, well, where did that come from? Oh, that's good government. You know, it is illegal for the government to tax and get a surplus. It is not illegal for the government to say, well, this is where that fund's going to go. Oops, we made a mistake, or oops, we didn't do that, or oops. But they're still government is taking money that they're not using for the express need, and they'll typically put it into 2 places. One is the fund balance, right, a reserve, because that's good for borrowing later. It makes our credit rating look good. So when we have a big project that we want to do, it's easier to get. The second place that it goes is into CIP. It goes into these projects. So we create this 5-year plan, and we may do them, we may not do them. What is the ultimate issue that I have with budgets is that we are not tight enough on our budgets. We take one thing and it becomes another thing and it ends up becoming another thing and it grows government. We're never cutting government. We're never saying, you know what, how about we put $25,000 more into veteran services, and we're going to take a little bit out of every other department to help do that because we believe our veterans who were ignored in the opioid gap analysis, we want to help them. We don't do that. What we say is let's just take another $25,000, whether it be from a reserve or it be additional levy or it's going to be casual employment funding. Those are the points that I'm making. I'm not saying that anyone in the administration is doing anything wrong. I'm not saying they're bad people. This is what government does, and I would just like to ask, are you considering that? And at what point do we just say we don't need as much money as they're telling us we need to give them? Thank you.
Supervisor Sandalski, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got a question on the, I'm looking at the general fund here, the paperwork, we got it, that was in the packet. So under the health department, last year I'm looking at it was budgeted for $3,499,058, and then this year the budget is $11,732,000, and that's according to this it says 235% increase, and that from my just thinking about math, that's over 300 because it's 35, times 3. That's over 300% increase. From what I'm seeing, is that correct, or are there's numbers wrong, or get what I'm looking at?
Can you clarify what page you're on or what document?
I'm on the one that was in the packet.
Oh, the budget publication? Sam, I think he's looking at what got published in the paper.
Yeah, it's under the health. It goes general government, public safety, health. I was just wondering because the numbers don't seem like they add up.
I think part of that ended up being because of the grants fund. Hold on here.
If you're looking for the difference between the department's budgets year to year, a good place to look is on page 170 of the budget book, which is the appendix. And you look for the health department, for example, it talks about a $32,000 tax levy difference as opposed to, and I'll look at the publication document you're talking about, but certainly there's not a department that's had a 300%
That's a,
levy increase. But
well,
I can,
it says 235 on here, 235 increase. And in numbers, it's just kind of weird because the budget for, so the actual from 2023 was $8,795,000, and then it was budgeted for $3,449,000 for 2024. And then the actual right now, it says through 8/31/24 was 7.817. Numbers just kind of, it's kind of confusing, I guess.
I'll have to look into that a little bit further, but the health department in and of itself only went up $32,677 on the levy. But I can get back to you on that. And when you're looking at the publication, it's the functions of government. So I'd have to look a little bit more closely at the health department to gather that number for you.
yeah, we can let you know what's underneath that. But again, Appendix F of the budget is the general fund budget by department with the changes. So health department in 2025, the total tax levy for the health department is $2,644,860 as was proposed. So to Sam's point, that's probably there are more things certainly underneath that umbrella of function of government, of health, than just the health department. But we'll pull that out for you.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Okay, we'll move on to item D, standing committee chairpersons or designees. Any announcements and/or reports by standing committee chairpersons or designees? Supervisor Robinson, please.
Again, just a reminder that the Finance Committee will be meeting on November 11th to consider discussions before the 12th County Board meeting. But I do want to give you a quick update on the broadband equity access deployment program. We just this week received notification of the preliminary project units that will be used to allocate the $55 million of federal funding flowing through the Public Service Commission. There are 113 different units in Marathon County. The internet service providers are basically driving the process. They will need to submit proposals to the Public Service Commission by, we now think, the middle of January. We will be asked to comment or provide letters of support for them in a competitive situation. There's up to 12 points that can be awarded due to local community engagement, either in the local or the county level. So we'll have more. We'll be coming to you in December with recommendations on which projects we might support. There's 8,443 or underserved locations in the county that we're hoping to get covered through this process.
Okay, any other announcements and, reports or presentations by standing committee chairs? Okay, we'll move on then. Education and discussion regarding items for the Tuesday, November 12th, 2024 meeting. Under item E, 14 ordinances, under E, 14A, for the town of Holton rezone, Zach Zoo for Peggy's LLC, ordinance 43-24. Any questions? Okay, moving on to resolutions, E15. E15A, County Board of Supervisors authorizing the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee to hold an additional public hearing on the budget on November 12th, 2024. This is going to be a voted on actionable item. And again, to give a little more context, again, when we initially set the meeting for today and published it was supposed and has to, by state statute, be published 15 days in advance in our official newspaper. We and the HR finance director, along with the administrator, had confirmation from or had communications, I should say, with our official publication, and they were promised that it would get published on the 17th, which would, in fact, provide for the 15 days prior to this notice. The fact was that they did not get it published on the 17th, and they published it on the 20th. And so that isn't 15 days in advance. And so we have had to repost and republish to have another public hearing. And so this would authorize the HR Finance Committee to hold a second public hearing on the budget on the November 11th, and it has been published 15 days in advance. So that's the background of it. Is there any discussion, or what is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Marash and seconded by Supervisor Lemmer to approve. Any further discussion? Vice Chair Dickinson, please.
Sorry, I had to get back in open meeting. Last year, when was the hearing held? Was it held in the evening, like at 6 p.m., or was it held at 3 p.m.?
It was held at 7 p.m. last.
Okay. I guess then I would make a motion to move it to the evening at a time, 6 p.m., I guess is what I would say, simply because it would allow people who can't.
That I would have to say that motion's out of order.
Okay.
Because, and only because we published it in the paper to have that meeting in the paper and published for a 3 p.m. meeting time. So we couldn't change it to a 7 p.m. meeting time and not be in violation of our own notice.
Sure. Then I would ask that next year, if this comes up, that it be duly noted that we should have an evening hearing to allow potentially the most people to show up. Thank you.
Thank you. Well noted. Any further discussion? Supervisor Sandalski, please.
Yeah, I agree with that comment because a lot of public work during the day, so get more input from the public because we're here to serve the people. So I agree with that. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. A motion, yes, will authorize the HR Finance Committee to hold the public hearing on the 11th at 3 p.m. as published. I'm going to need responses verbally from Supervisor Hardinger,
Yes.
Supervisor Seibert,
Yes.
Supervisor Crivelli. Supervisor Crivelli? And we'll proceed. And the motion is carried. Thank you, and we will move on to item E, 15B from the Transportation Coordinating Committee and Health and Human Services Committee. 1, approval of the 2025 85.21 Elderly and Disabled Transportation Grant Application, Resolution 53-24. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to E15C from the Parks Commission and the Environmental Resources Committee. Item E15C, an intergovernmental agreement to provide the park and recreational services for the city of Wausau. Resolution 54-24. Any questions? Supervisor Sandalski, please.
So I don't know if anybody can answer this. Is there anything that's changed from the previous year agreement as far as any changes, I guess?
Corp Counsel will address the question, please. Thank you.
Yep. So none of the services that are being provided have changed. The agreement itself is new. Statutorily, there should be an agreement in place whenever a city delegates the authority over its parks to a county. We've been doing that for the city since 1926, and we have not had an agreement in place. So this memorializes the current status quo and protects us moving forward as far as what services we're required to provide at what funding level. So kind of a long way to answer your question. There isn't a current agreement, but this is consistent with the current service levels that are being provided.
And the city did take this up and has approved this. Okay, any other discussion on that item, the intergovernmental agreement? Okay, we'll move on to E15D from Human Resources, Finance and Property Committee. 1, D1, to establish a reserve in the Social Improvement Fund for the use for out-of-county placements, Resolution 55-24. Any discussion? Okay, and then finally, item D, E15D2, the 2025 Budget and Property Tax Levy Resolution, as we discussed earlier. Any further discussion? All right, we are down to item F, miscellaneous business, announcements and/or requests. Any announcements and/or requests? I guess I would, Supervisor Draybeck, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to back up here, if I could go back up to E, under ordinances, the town of Holton rezone. The guy's name is Zach Rao. There's a misprinter, and I couldn't look it up fast enough on the computer because I'm slow. So.
Okay. That's a typo error, but that's what the clerk mentions that she received. So we'll make that change. It's Zach Rao for Peggy's LLC. Thank you. The other announcement that I would have is with the board's approval of Operation Greenlight, and next week being the week of Veterans Week, I'd like to congratulate and thank all of the veterans that we have in our viewing audience, all of the veterans that we have serving on the board, all of the veterans that are in our viewing audience for their dedication and their service to our country. And we will be, in support of that, we will be shining a light on the courthouse that will be green, consistent with Operation Greenlight. And I would encourage anyone individually, I have personally gone out and purchased green lights to put in my porch lights to turn them green during the recognition of the veterans over the week of the 4th through the 11th. So if you're so inclined to show the support to those veterans and their families for the sacrifices that they have made, I think that would be great. It's an initiative that was started by NACO, and we have over 300 counties already involved, and we're getting more and more counties involved in that support each and every year. So thank you. Any other announcements and or requests? All right, we are down to item 17. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Drabek and seconded by Supervisor Marash to adjourn. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and enjoy your beautiful weekend.